Stealing and still holding your head high, what a shameless piece of work. I glared at Vivian Cross as she casually plugged her ATV into my home's power supply. She sneered, "It's not like your electricity is for worship." But the moment the ATV went up in flames, that arrogant HOA went dead silent. Never mistake silence from the weak as ignorance of how to strike back. What state are you in? Have you ever dealt with a neighbor like this? I remember that morning clearly. Just as sunlight began filtering through the kitchen curtains, I had finished pouring my cup of coffee. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the cool morning air brought a brief sense of calm, but it didn't last long. When I opened the envelope containing the elect bill I had just picked up from the mailbox, my eyes immediately stopped at the bold number printed in the top right corner of the page. I frowned. In just 1 month, the electricity cost had nearly doubled. That wasn't normal. I've always been careful, swapped every light bulb in the house for energy-saving ones long ago, even taught my daughter, Elena, to unplug things when they're not in use. Every month, I review our usage, adjust the air conditioner and water heater, and make sure no device is running harder or longer than it should. There was no reason for a sudden spike in the bill unless something was happening that I hadn't noticed. A sense of unease stirred, like a small flame flickering in my chest. I set the paper down on the table, took a deep breath, and walked to the back of the house, to the electric meter, the kind of place no one pays attention to unless something goes wrong. It was still early. Somewhere in the distance, birds chirped between the rustling branches of old oak trees, swaying gently in the breeze. As I approached the meter, everything seemed normal at first, but after just a few seconds of looking, I noticed something strange. From the bottom of my meter box, black wire had been carefully threaded out, running flush along the edge of the weathered wooden fence before slipping quietly into the neighbor's yard. Froze, heart pounding faster. What the hell is this? I squinted, bent down to take a closer look. That wire definitely wasn't there yesterday. I'm someone who notices every detail around the house, and something this off wouldn't have escaped me if it had already been in place. The first thought hit me like a jolt of ice. Someone's siphoning electricity from my house. My face flushed hot, fists tightening without me realizing. A swirl of questions surged: who, why, and how. But whoever it was obvious they did it deliberately and in secret. I swallowed hard and decided to follow the wire. I circled around to the side gate, moving carefully like a detective. Slow, steady step, closing the distance bit by bit. The wire stretched across the lawn, clinging to the weather-stained white wall, then led directly into the backyard of Vivian Cross. My chest tightened. Vivian, that name alone felt like pressing on an open wound. And there she was, right in front of me, standing next to a gleaming red ATV that looked freshly washed, plugging in the power cord that traced back to that same black wire. She looked completely unfazed, as if enjoying a calm, leisurely morning. Her blonde hair was brushed back smoothly, face carefully made up, lips curled into a smug little smile. She looked like someone who had just pulled off a clever deal, and honestly, she had, if I hadn't caught her. I stood frozen, mouth bitter as ash. The anger flared up like gasoline on fire, but it was still wrapped in a layer of shock. I had never encountered anyone so brazen. In my mind, images of Vivian at HOA meetings came rushing back, always seated in the center, speaking with a bossy tone, never allowing interruptions, always presenting herself as the guardian of community values. And yet here she was, the very person who claimed to be some moral beacon, plugging a stolen power line straight into my house like it was the most natural thing in the world. No attempt to hide it, no shame at all. I couldn't take it anymore. I marched straight over, trying to keep my voice level, though every word carried fury. "What the hell are you doing?" Vivian flinched slightly and turned around, but instead of looking startled or embarrassed, she just gave me a dismissive glance, scanning me from head to toe with disdain. Shrugged, like I was some kid, blowing things out of proportion. "You've got extra power. What's the harm in sharing? Around here, I make the rules." A sentence I couldn't believe I had just heard. There wasn't a shred of remorse in her voice, only blatant arrogance. I stood there speechless, not out of fear, but because I had never seen anyone so willing to treat others with contempt. "It's my electricity, paid with my money," I said, clenched teeth. "You steal it and act like you've got your own set of rules?" Vivian sneered. "You're new here, so you probably don't get it. In this neighborhood, I set the rule. If you can't handle that, you'll have to learn. Don't think just because you bought a house, you can do whatever you want." Oh. I stood there, blood rushing to my head, my eyes locked onto the ATV charging beside her, its tiny blinking LED light mocking me. I wanted to rip out the plug, to shout loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear, but I held back. Not out of weakness, because I knew if I exploded, she'd twist the story and paint me as the problem. Another disruptive element in the community, like she loved to say. Clenched my fist, forcing the rising fury down. "This is your last warning. Don't touch my electricity again." Vivian lifted her chin, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Go ahead and try. This is just the beginning. I don't scare easily." I turned and walked away, feet heavy but head clear. I knew this confrontation was far from over. Back inside, I dropped into the chair, my hands still trembling with anger. "Elena, My daughter, came out of her study room, her eyes worried. "Dad, why is your face so red?" I smiled, ruffled her hair, trying to stay calm. I didn't want her to worry. But deep down I told myself, this isn't over. She's going to pay. No one gets to treat others like that. Especially not with theft and arrogance like she's entitled to it. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out into the backyard. That black wire still lay there, bold and blatant on the lawn like a throbbing stain. The red ATV still gleamed under the fading light of day, but to my eyes, it looked no different than an intruder on my land. And in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. This was the beginning of a war. A war Vivian Cross had no idea she had just ignited. Under the pale morning sunlight, the air was still chilly, dew clinging to the damp grass. The neighborhood was quiet as usual, except for the occasional birdsong from the roadside trees. And right in the middle of that stillness, I bent down, gripped black power cord plugged tightly into the charging port of the ATV parked near the fence, and yanked it hard. A dry, snapping sound tore through the calm. The indicator light on the charger went dead instantly, leaving behind a cold, taut silence, sharp as a wire. And then, just as expected, hurried footsteps rang out behind me, followed by the sudden appearance of Vivian Cross. Her carefully made-up face twisted with rage in an instant. The smug calm vanished, placed by unfiltered fury. "Don't get disrespectful. Don't think just because you're new, you can stir things up," she shrieked, her high-pitched voice clawing at the quiet air, making it feel like even the wooden fence between our yards trembled. Her voice wasn't just a scolding, it was a declaration of power, a warning, a signal that I had officially become a thorn in the side of this self-appointed matriarch. I gripped the power cord tighter in my hand, stood my ground, my eyes locked on hers like a reflex of survival. No word, no argument. I let my silence be my resistance, cold and unyielding like stone facing a crashing wave. But Vivian didn't flinch. She stepped in closer, lowered her voice, her eyes narrowing with hostility, as if measuring me by standards only she understood. "People like you don't fit in here. Don't bring your bad habits into this neighborhood," said, soft as wind, sharp as a blade. That sentence, masked as advice, landed like an indictment, stamped with prejudice. I didn't need to guess, didn't need to imagine. In the way she leaned into the phrase, "people like you," I heard the contempt clearly, felt the invisible wall she was trying to erect between me and the rest of this community. It wasn't a new feeling. It brought back memories of being scrutinized in grocery stores, the side glances when walking into meeting, and the harmless joke steeped in bias. And now, it was here again, more vivid than ever, in my own backyard. I felt my cheeks burn, unsure if it was anger or shame, my heart pounding like war drums. In a flash, the past came flooding back like a surge, every small moment of being dismissed, every time I had to swallow my fury to keep things appropriate. Feeling had returned now, without mercy. I wanted to scream in her face that she was wrong, wanted to force her to back down, to see the truth, but I knew I couldn't. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood the rules of the game. One impulsive gesture, one word too far, and she'd have the excuse she needed to call the cops, to brand me as troublemaker, someone unfit for a civilized community. No, I wasn't stupid enough to hand her the justification to legitimize her exclusion. I stood there, teeth clenched, holding back the surge of emotion swelling in my chest like an undertow. In my mind, a sentence rang out, clear as a command from deep within. If she wants war, I'll show her what war looks like. But on my term. Vivian stared at me for a few more seconds, as if waiting to see what I would do. Then, she stepped forward, yanked cord from my hand, threw it to the ground, and stomped on it with her pristine white sneakers. A smirk curled on her lip, but her eyes weren't as certain as before. Maybe she hadn't expected me to fight back, to rip out the cord in front of her, to resist so directly. I turned away, not wanting to escalate further. But I hadn't taken 3 steps before her voice rang out behind me, cold and cutting. "You'll learn your place soon enough, Marcus Grant." I paused for half a second, but didn't turn around. That sentence carved itself across my back like a dull blade, painful, but not enough to break me. On the contrary, it sharpened me. I understood then this wasn't some temporary neighborhood spat. This was a battle for position, for existence, for dignity, and I wasn't about to let anyone trample on that. Back inside, I dropped onto the sofa, feeling like my whole body had just walked off a battlefield. My hands still trembled slightly, not fear, but from fury trapped with no way out. Elena, my daughter, stepped out of her bedroom, hair messy from sleep, eyes wide and confused. She sat next to me, resting her head on my shoulder, saying nothing. I looked at her, throat tight. I couldn't let her grow up in a place like this, a place where discrimination wore polite words, where power was used to silence anyone who didn't fall in line. In my mind, a plan began to form, still vague, but with a clear destination. I wouldn't let this go. I would gather evidence. I would rally the other neighbor. I would expose the rotten authority Vivian clung to. She might be used to controlling everything. This time, the wrong person. I didn't move here to bow my head. I came to live by my values and to protect my daughter from people like her. The afternoon passed, and the last light of day slanted through the glass window, casting long shadows across the floor. I stood up, pulled back the curtain, and my eyes fixed on the backyard. The power cord was still there, cold and lifeless, but to me, it felt like a narrow trench marking the first day of a long war. I knew what was coming wouldn't be easy. There would be rumors, suspicious glances, and passive-aggressive reminders from the neighborhood board, but I was ready. It was time to take a stand, not just for me, but for everyone else, quietly enduring the same. Vivian's game started with a single wire, but in the end, it would come from a place she never saw coming. The next morning, just as I stepped out the door to grab the paper, I noticed a white sheet tucked into the mailbox. The red seal of the Homeowners Association stood out at the top, along with an italicized notice about a landscape violation. I frowned and tore it open. The stated reason: the grass in my front yard exceeded the allowed height by 2 inches. I looked out at the lawn, neatly trimmed, lush, evenly cut because I had mowed it over the weekend. What were they trying to pull? Before I could set the paper down, I spotted another envelope beneath the morning paper. This time, it was for a neighborhood parking violation. My car had been parked slightly over the line. I let out a dry, brittle laugh. 2 citations in less than 12 hours, both arriving conveniently after I had yanked Vivian Cross's ATV cord out of the socket. I didn't need more proof to see she was launching a coordinated campaign. I sat at the kitchen table and laid both papers out. The language was commanding, the tone cold, offering no room for discussion. The way they described minor infractions, framing them as threats to the community, made Vivian's hand obvious. She didn't just want payback. She wanted to turn me into a habitual offender, the name always brought up at HOA meeting. By noon, as I walked Elena outside for her tutoring session, I caught sight of Vivian standing with 2 other HOA members just outside my gate. One held a camera, the other a board. All 3 were crouched, snapping photos of the flower bed along the walkway. When they saw me, none of them flinched. Vivian turned, smirking like someone who had just secured a win. "We're inspecting to ensure community standard," she said loudly enough for Elena to hear. "Everyone has to follow the rule, you included." I swallowed my anger and moved closer to my daughter to keep her from getting scared. Elena gripped my hand tighter, her worried eyes fixed on Vivian. I gave her a small shake of the head, signaling not to worry. But inside, I knew I had just become the official target. That afternoon, while pulling the car into the garage, I heard a quiet voice calling from across the street. An elderly man with silver hair, thin frame, and a cane stepped over his voice roughened by age. It was Mr. Alvarez, someone I had only greeted in passing before. He glanced around, then whispered, "She did the same to me. Anyone who pushes back gets crushed." He spoke with tired resignation, recounting how, years earlier, after his wife passed away, he was repeatedly fined by the HOA for what they claimed was poor lawn up. They cited visual impact, but he knew the real reason was that he had opposed a decision Vivian pushed through. Within months, he had to sell off assets to cover fines and legal fees. Since then, he had stayed quiet, living like a ghost in his own home. I listened, feeling a heavy stone press against my chest. Alvarez wasn't making things up. The sorrow in his eyes was proof of what I was about to face. I placed a hand on his shoulder, nodding gently in place of a promise. A resolve stirred in my mind. I wouldn't let my story become a copy of that tragedy. The next day, I counted 3 separate times Vivian and her followers walked past my house. Each time, they took photos, jotted notes, and made a point of looking straight through the window where I stood. Their stares were like dull blades, slowly slicing into my patience. Their intention was clear: turn me into someone under constant surveillance, so anyone passing by would assume I was a non-compliant resident. That evening, as I sat in the living room, 2 more notices arrived. One cited the garage door paint as not in line with community standards, even though it was the original color when I bought the house. The other mentioned unsuitable items placed on the porch, referring to the old wooden chair where Elena and I usually sat to watch the stars. Every small detail, every ordinary object, CT was twisted and dragged out as justification for a charge. Elena looked at me, her voice soft as wind. "Dad, do they hate us?" I sat down and held her close. I wanted to say no, that it was just a misunderstanding, but lying to my daughter would have been cowardly. I simply whispered, "Someone's trying to make things hard for us, but we won't be afraid. Do you hear me?" She nodded, but the confusion still lingered in her eyes. That night, I sat alone, facing a stack of violation notices. Each one lay neatly, cold and clinical, like evidence in a trial. I knew I was in their crosshairs, and this game was far from over. Vivian wanted to see me crushed, wanted the entire community to look at me with disdain, but what she didn't understand was that the more she tried to push me down, the harder I would rise. I picked up a pen and began writing a log: every date, every charge, the actual condition of the house. I took photos, recorded every detail. If Vivian thought I'd sit and take it in silence, she had picked the wrong person. The next day, I mowed the lawn even though it was already perfect. I polished the garage door until it gleamed. I repositioned the wooden chair, placing it neatly against the wall. I wanted to see what else they would try to use against me. Just as I finished, Vivian walked by with her 2 associates. She stopped, squinted at the yard, and said loud enough for me to hear, "Neat work, but still not up to standard." I turned to look at her, my expression calm, though inside, I was laughing bitterly. I understood this game would go until one of us gave up, and I knew without a doubt it wouldn't be me. If your neighbor brazenly stole electricity and then turned around and fined you for it, what would you do? Drop a comment. One sweltering afternoon, the asphalt out front shimmered with sunlight, waves of heat rising and warping the view. The air was still, not a single branch stirred. Sweat soaked through the back of my shirt the moment I wheeled the bike into the yard, discomfort creeping into every step, every breath. But it wasn't the heat that made my heart pound in my chest. It was the glance I cast toward the fence, and the sight of that familiar black power cord, draped across like a slash across the face, truly made my blood boil. In a flash, I was moving toward the electric meter at the back of the house, heart pounding like a war drum. I knew I wasn't mistaken, and just as I feared, Vivian Cross, compact figure and neatly pinned up hair, was crouched beside her blindingly red ATV. She bent down as if fussing with something harmless, but her hand had already slipped plug into the extension outlet, a move full of calculation and pure disregard. The way she did it, not hurried, not discreet, as if my yard were an extension of her legal domain, made me feel like a man invaded on his own land. I had tolerated enough. I had pretended not to see, told myself it wasn't worth stirring conflict with a neighbor so early into my move to Lakeside. But that patience had been crushed beneath the polished soles of her shoes. I didn't want to hold back anymore. Without thinking, I shouted, my voice cutting over the low grumble of a nearby engine. Unplug that now. This is my property. Vivian jerked back. For a split second, her face showed surprise, but it vanished in an instant. Instead of backing down or showing any hint of shame, she lifted her chin, her eyes hardening, and a second later, her shrill voice pierced the air, echoing like a siren down the street. He's threatening a woman. This man is a menace. That sound sliced through the oppressive air like an arrow, snapping the neighborhood out of its heat-stunned haze. Windows flew open, curtains yanked aside in a rush. From the porch across the street, from the second floor of the house next door, faces began to appear. Some tilted their head, some wore sunglasses and stared, and one mother pulled her child indoors, as if shielding them from something awful. An elderly couple walking their dog froze mid-step, confusion written across their faces. The whole block, silent under the baking sun just moments before, now stirred like it had been jolted awake by an alarm. And Vivian, still shrieking like a woman with a megaphone, didn't miss a beat as she slipped into her role as the perfect. Before I could get a word out, before I could call out the blatant theft of electricity, Vivian stepped forward and pointed straight at me, as if I were a criminal, caught red-handed in a public square. This is exactly the kind of person bringing trouble into this neighborhood. Just moved in and already threatening women. He doesn't deserve to live in Lakeside. Every word she spat out carried weight like a weapon. I could already see a few neighbors' eyes begin to shift. They hadn't seen her sneakily plug the cord into my outlet. They only saw a middle-aged woman, neatly groomed, speaking with authority. Someone with social, standing a longtime HOA president, being confronted by an unfamiliar man raising his voice. They saw a newcomer, a name they didn't know, standing in his own yard with clenched fists and fire in his eyes. To them, can't be seen is often drowned out by the louder voice, and this time, that voice belonged to Vivian. I tried not to lose control. I kept my voice low, firm and clear. You plugged into my meter, and I have the right to stop that. Don't twist this. I knew even the most reasonable words could be swallowed whole by the performance Vivian was staging for everyone. She threw her head back and gave a cold laugh, then lowered her voice so only I could hear, her tone slithering like a snake across the ground. You won't last here. That wasn't a burst of anger. It was a move, part of a longer strategy. I looked into her eyes and understood this was no longer about a few dollars of electricity. Vivian wasn't defending some petty convenience. She was fortifying her position, cutting down anyone who might threaten the shadow power she had built over the years of manipulating this community. Around us, the murmurs began. Snippets of phrases like tiny needles, probably just an argument. Then, I heard he's got a temper. These whispers cut deeper than any shouting could, because they were judgments from people who didn't care about truth, only about sensing who held more credibility. I clenched my fists but stood firm, refusing to step back. If you think this whole community will stay under your thumb forever, you're wrong. This is my electricity, and I won't let anyone touch it. Vivian turned toward the neighbors, her voice still sweet as honey-laced venom. You all see what I'm dealing with? I just wanted to keep the peace in this neighborhood. And he storms over, rips out the cord, and threatens me. Is this how a new resident should behave? She knew how to command public space with her word, when to scream, when to soften, and how to play both sides in front of an audience. I almost snapped back. I wanted to tell it all about the first time I saw the cord, about her excuses, about the threats behind that smile. But I stopped myself. In that moment, I realized I was one breath away from falling into her trap. If I lost it, if I shouted, I'd become exactly what she was painting me as, the unstable newcomer, the disrupt. And that was all she needed to keep her show going. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving Vivian. I saw her lips curl into a smug, half smile of triumph. But I saw something else too, the slick, oily look in her eyes, the look of someone who's used to manipulating, used to winning through cunning. In that moment, I understood. Vivian wasn't just a woman stealing electricity. She was a hidden force in this neighborhood, someone who knew how to twist truth using reputation, status, and mob psychology. I turned and walked back inside, the door closing behind me like a drawn line. But outside, The murmurs didn't stop. The pieces on the board were already in motion. Elena looked at me from the living room, her eyes a mix of innocence and worry. I gave her a small nod to reassure her, but there was no calm inside me. I knew that from today forward, I had stepped into a battle with no clear end, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of the silent power behind that HOA, the one I thought only trimmed lawns and sent reminder email. Vivian Cross was no petty thief. She was a manipulator of the rule, and I, by doing nothing more than ripping out a single cord, had officially become enemy number one. That evening, the sky over Lakeside was covered in a heavy layer of gray cloud, as if it too sensed the unease that was coming. The streetlights cast a dull, yellow haze over the cold, spotless brick road. The model homes, the perfectly trimmed lawns, the HOA flags fluttering gently in the breeze, all of it painted a picture of peace so artificial. It felt like everything here had been arranged to please someone, rather than serve the people who actually lived in it. I stepped through the door of the community center, feeling like I was walking into a courtroom where I was the defendant, the witness, and the pre-selected target of public shame. The low ceiling made the room feel even more cramped. Rows of fluorescent lights buzzed cold and bright above, exposing every wrinkle, every cautious, curious glance beneath them. The plastic chairs were lined up perfectly, not a detail out of place. I recognized a few people: Mrs. Harit, with her worn wool scarf always wrapped around her neck, Mr. Alvarez, sitting in the back row, his eyes sunken and silent. But most were just faces I had passed behind glass, never spoken to by name. The air was thick with caution. People hadn't come because they cared, came because they were curious to see how Vivian Cross, the self-crowned queen of Lakeside, would handle me. Vivian stood at the center of the room as if she had rehearsed this performance dozens of times in her mind. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice rang out loud and sharp. She raised her hand and pointed directly at me, as if calling a criminal out in the town square. "People like Marcus Grant don't respect the rules, and they ruin the community," she said, her gaze as sharp as a blade. That statement wasn't just a personal attack. It was a message to the entire room, that anyone who dared to cross her, anyone who dared to defy what she deemed proper, would be dragged into the light just like this, humiliated and alone. Whispers rose like waves. Some eyes turned toward me, measuring, half believing, half suspicious. Few people lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. I sat still, hands clenched on my thighs, trying to keep my breath from breaking. I had known this was coming, had pictured all the ways she might strike, but hearing it with my own ears, in a crowded room, it still hit like a direct punch. Vivian continued her monologue like she was reading from a carefully prepared indictment. She opened a folder, flipping through the pages, practiced flair. "According to the new policy recently approved by the Homeowners Association," she said in a voice even but loaded with insinuation, "the use of personal electricity for equipment that affects community aesthetics is a violation. Bulky, disruptive devices must be strictly regulated, and Mr. Marcus is the first to violate that rule." At that moment, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I stood up and let out a dry, cutting laugh, a jagged sound that scraped against the room's polished order. "This is absurd," I said loudly. "You stole electricity from my meter, and now you're making up rules to blame me?" The room froze. A few eyes widened, a few lips tightened, and they turned away. No one spoke, but I could feel the surprise spreading like an oil slick. In the corner of the room, Mr. Alvarez's gaze rested on me deep and still. He said nothing, but I could read the agreement in his eyes, and the worry. Vivian faltered for a split second, then pressed her lips together and resumed her performance of power. "Here, I am the law," she said, pausing on each word. Her voice fell like hammers, pounding against the silence in the room. I looked around. A few residents lowered their heads, like they'd been struck by the very sentence. They were too used to the way she ran things, too used to her tyranny, wrapped in the packaging of community interests. I couldn't hold it anymore. "If you think you can just write your own rules to legitimize theft, then you've underestimated the intelligence of this neighborhood." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "This community is peaceful because of me. For years, property values from dropping, kept our environment clean. The ones who threaten that peace are people like you, people who defy stability." Her words dripped like sweet poison, persuasive enough to sway the timid, just cruel enough to scare off dissent. From the back row, a trembling voice spoke up. It was Mrs. Harriet. "But Marcus just moved in. How could he have ruined anything?" All eyes turned toward the elderly woman. Vivian spun around immediately, her eyes blazing. "Do you want your home's value to crash? Look at his yard cluttered with violations. You can't turn a blind eye." Harriet fell silent, as if dragged back to the quiet role she had long been conditioned to fill. I clenched my fist. "You can scream, you can twist paperwork, but you can't hide the truth forever. I saw you plug your ATV into my outlet. That's theft, not leadership." Vivian smirked. "Do you have proof? Any witnesses? Or just another cheap accusation?" The room stirred again. The line between suspicion and fear was now paper thin. I took a breath, each word slow and steady as stone. I don't have today, but I will. And when that day comes, everyone will know who the real violator island. No one spoke, no one clapped, but I felt something shift, like a breeze, slipping through the wall of silence that had long gripped community. Vivian stared at me, then changed her tone softer, but still sharp. I suggest you learn how to adapt. Lakeside isn't for rebel. If you want to stay quiet and comply. I met her eyes. I didn't move here to bow my head. If you want a war, I'll walk it to the end with you. The words came out clear, with no hesitation. Vivian's face flickered. She turned away, and coldly declared the meeting adjourned. That night, when I stepped outside, the darkness had fully fallen. Few residents gave subtle nods. A few glances passed with silent solidarity. Alvarez came closer, his aged hand resting on my shoulder light, but steady. You just did what no one's dared to do in years. But be careful, Marcus. Vivian doesn't forget, and she doesn't forgive. I nodded. The night sky above was black. There was no turning back, but I didn't need to. In that moment, I knew I had stepped into the fight for real, and this time, I wasn't fighting just for myself. After the tense meeting full of scheming and threats, I thought I had seen the full truth of Vivian Cross, a woman who ruled through fear, twisted logic, and a shamelessness with no limit. But only a few days later, I realized that confrontation was just the opening act. The real battle doesn't begin when things happen in plain sight. It turns brutal when the enemy hides behind whispers, turned heads, and unsigned letters. In Lakeside, rumors travel faster than the neatly printed community newsletters. They slip into every corner, slither past half-closed doors, weave through casual sidewalk chats in the early morning or late afternoon, and by the time they hit someone else's ears, they've taken on a new shape, bigger, uglier, and accepted as unquestionable truth. On one such morning, as I held Elena's hand and stepped out the gate to walk her to the bus stop at the end of the street, I heard two housewives whispering nearby. The way they looked at me told me immediately that the story involved me. One of them, petite in a beige sweater, glanced in my direction and said just loud enough not to seem obvious, "Heard he owes months of HOA fees, probably doesn't plan to pay either. Embarrassing for the whole neighborhood." The other nodded, eyes drifting down to Elena, as if she were the unfortunate child of a failed man. I said nothing, not a word, but my hand gripped Elena's tighter without meaning to, enough that she looked up at me, clear eyes waiting for an explanation. I turned away, heart heavy. How do you explain to a child that lies are often easier for people to believe than the truth? That same afternoon, I was watering plants in the backyard. The sun hadn't fully set, but the light had turned a pale orange, casting long shadows across the lawn I tended every weekend. A young couple walked past the gate, pushing a stroller, whispering in a tone just loud enough for me to hear. Guys like him bring bad kids into the area, and then the whole neighborhood won't be peaceful anymore. Every word was like a clean slice, no shouting, no insult, just one sentence sharp enough to stain a person's character. I stood still, the hose still running, water trickling onto the roots, but making no familiar sound. In that moment, I understood clearly that the source of it all was none other than Vivian. She didn't need to show her face. All she had to do was plant a few seeds of doubt, and they would grow into a dense, dangerous forest of suspicion. The people here, even those without malice, would side with stability because they feared disruption. They feared losing the artificial calm they attached to words like rule, community image, and property value. But even as I was surrounded by those wary looks, I still caught other eyes quieter, more hesitant, carrying real empathy. A slight nod as I passed, sincere greeting, small gestures, yes, but like stakes in the ground, reminding me I wasn't the only one awake in this trance. That night, while I was gathering dry leaves in the backyard, Mr. Alvarez, the quietest man in the neighborhood, called me over to his house. His home was simple, old, but clean and warm. The air held the scent of wood, old books, and jasmine tea. He opened a worn laptop sitting on the table, the screen lighting up slowly, then turned to me and said softly, his voice slightly shaky but clear, "Marcus, you need to see this." On the screen was a series of photos, clear, sharp images, taken from the second-floor window of his house. Vivian Cross was charging her blazing red ATV, and the outlet was plugged directly into the power source on my property. The light from the charger reflected off her face, a face I couldn't mistake, and it was all happening in the early dim light, as if she thought no one would notice. Mr. Alvarez looked at me, his hand resting lightly on the computer mouse. "I took them more than once. I knew the day would come when you'd need them. I'm too old to fight her, but you're not. You've got the courage I didn't." I looked at him for a long moment, then back at the screen. Those photos, in that instant, felt like confirmation that I wasn't crazy, wasn't wrong, and above all, wasn't alone. This was living proof, the thing that could flip the entire game. I gripped Mr. Alvarez's hand. "Thank you, really. This is what she won't be able to run from." That night, back home, I sat alone in the living room. The desk lamp cast a soft golden light over the stack of HOA violation notices growing thicker by the day, like they were meant to crush my patience. I looked at the printed photos, flipping through them one by one, my blood simmering. So many accusations, so many lies, and now the truth clear, cold, and undeniable. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. In my mind appeared the image of Vivian at that last meeting, the way she held her head high, the sharp voice declaring, "Here, I am the law." I whispered silently to myself, like a promise, "No, you are not the law. Not this time." When I opened my eyes, I felt part of the weight lift from my chest. Not because the fight ahead would be easy, but because for the first time, I knew I had a weapon. Not just the photos, the truth. Quiet, but real, support. The belief in justice, however faint. Vivian wanted to use this entire community to crush me, to make me a warning to anyone else thinking of rising up, but I didn't move here to bow my head. I came to build a life worthy of me and my daughter, and if I had to fight for that, I wouldn't hesitate. This battle was no longer about an ATV or an electric bill. It was about the right to exist without being threatened, about holding those in power accountable. And I, Marcus Grant, would be the one to spark the change Lakeside had gone far too long without facing. In the days that followed, not a single morning passed in peace. Every time the sun had yet fully rise above the horizon, when mist still floated above the front lawn, and the quiet of dawn remained untouched by the day's rhythm, the engine of Vivian Cross's ATV would roar like an alarm siren. That sound wasn't just machinery, it was an arrow aimed at my ears, cutting through walls, slicing through the fragile layer of patience I tried to rebuild each day. Her ATV screamed, as if it had been programmed for provocation. She drove it in loops around her yard, then stopped just near the fence dividing our properties, revving the engine hard, letting the roar echo through every window. Some mornings, step outside, still groggy, just in time to see her perched on that blood-red machine, head thrown back in laughter. A high, shrill, spiteful laugh, as if the very sound of it was the weapon she used to drown out any resistance. Once, our eyes locked across the no words, no gestures, just a stare so direct it felt like time paused around it. Then she tilted her chin and smirked, crooked smile that landed like a slap without hands. In that moment, I needed no further signal. This was a declaration of war. Not a petty spat between neighbors, but a psychological siege, an attack through noise and power, steady, relentless, and laced with malice. The first day, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it might be a coincidence. But when it repeated each morning, same time, same theatric, I understood it was a strategy. She didn't just want to irritate me. She wanted the neighborhood to witness my cornering. She wanted to seed the idea that I wasn't in control of my own space. The ATV wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol, a rolling act of arrogance outside my door, there to remind me I wasn't welcome here. It didn't stop there. White envelopes started showing up regularly in my mailbox. Each day became a reverse lottery. I never knew what I'd be fined for next. One day, it was missing decorative shrubs on the porch. The next, trash bins not aligned with regulations, and even garage door paint not matching the approved color palette. Each notice was carefully documented, my name in bold, the fine clearly printed, cold and final-like lettering etched in stone. I wasn't in the wrong, not by any objective standard, but according to Vivian Cross and the HOA board where she controlled every process I'd been in violation since the day I moved into this neighborhood, I began keeping every single notice. Each night, after Elena had gone upstairs to bead she laid them out across the kitchen table like someone assembling evidence criminal. The dining table slowly turned into a place where I sat face to face with injustice, not from the law, but from a more dangerous kind of power. The power of those who believe they define what's acceptable. One night, Elena walked past, her eyes still heavy with sleep, and stopped beside me. She looked silently at the growing stack of papers, then gently placed her hand on my arm. "Dad, why does she hate us so much?" I couldn't answer right away. A sharp pain cut through my chest. How could I explain to my daughter that some people hate you because of your skin color, your accent, or simply because your presence doesn't fit into their version of normal? How could I tell her that some prejudices run so deep they survive generations, and sometimes, even when you've done nothing wrong, you're still the target? I just held her tightly, pulling her into my arms like I could build a wall to block out the cruelty of the world. "It's going to be okay," I whispered, though even to myself, it sounded like an empty promise. I knew I could endure the petty attack, could swallow the insults, and wait for the right moment, but I couldn't let Elena grow up feeling like our family was the thorn in the side of an entire neighborhood. I couldn't let her believe that staying quiet was the only way to stay safe. In that moment, I knew I had to act not out of pride, but out of duty as a father. That night, once Elena had fallen into deep sleep, quietly stepped into the garage, where the yellow light spilled over tools, hanging silently on the wall like they were waiting for a command. I opened an old toolbox, pulled out wires, switches, and bits of circuitry I'd saved from repairing our last house. I sat down among the parts, my my mind racing through a plan. Not a direct confrontation, not some useless shouting match. I wanted something smart, legal, and irrefutable, a way to make her pay without giving her anything to complain about. I started sketching a circuit, a smart cutoff system, placed right at the electric meter. It would function normally for everything inside the house, but if any abnormal draw came from outside, the circuit would trip instantly, even sending back a surge strong enough to damage anything illegally plugged in. I wasn't trying to sabotage, I just wanted to defend myself, but in a way that ensured the violator couldn't repeat what they'd done. I sat under the dim light, heart slowing with each line I drew, each connection I mapped. In my mind, I saw Vivian's ATV, that glossy red machine, screaming one last time, then falling silent on some smug morning, leaving her confused and powerless. She wouldn't know what hit her, but I would. And soon, the neighborhood would understand that some boundaries are not theirs to cross. I stood up and looked out through the small garage window. Outside, it was pitch dark, with only a few faint lights glowing from nearby houses. I knew that by morning Vivian would rev her engine as usual. I knew there'd be another fresh notice waiting in the mailbox. But this time, I was ready. I was no longer the one backed into a corner, standing by. I was the one quietly redrawing the line, and she would soon learn that every action comes with a price. I had expected the day Vivian Cross would come back, but when I saw that black cord draped across the fence again, my chest burned like it was on fire. She showed no hesitation now, casually pulling the plug, pressing the charger for that glossy red ATV, moving with the ease of someone savoring victory. I walked out fast, my voice hoarse with anger, but every word landed clean and hard. "You're going to regret this." Vivian looked up, her eyes cold, the corner of her mouth curled into a mocking smile. She let out a sharp laugh that rang across the yard. "You think you scare me? I've stolen electricity from plenty of people here, and no one's done a damn thing. You're no different." Those words landed like a blade, slicing through whatever patience I had left. I heard in every syllable a disgusting truth. Vivian didn't see theft as wrong, she saw it as natural power. The way she admitted to draining electricity from other homes, then lifted her chin in defiance, proved this wasn't some isolated act. It was a habit, a declaration that the whole neighborhood was under her heel. I glanced around and saw a few windows slightly cracked open, figures standing just behind the curtains. They heard, they knew, but no one stepped outside. That silence was the fertile ground where Vivian had ruled for years. I took a deep breath, my eyes locked on the arrogant face in front of me. One day, everyone will see you for what you are. And when that day comes, you won't be smiling. Vivian didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice hissing with clenched teeth. "You're still naive, fresh meat. I'll make sure this whole block despises you. You won't be able to breathe. You don't understand this game, Marcus, but you'll learn. You'll crawl through every rule I've written." I said nothing. Her words didn't need a rebuttal. They exposed themselves. The arrogance, the abuse of power, the belief that no one in this neighborhood would ever challenge her. I simply took a step back, eyes still locked on hers, then turned and walked back toward the house. Inside me, the anger hardened into something solid. But before I could fully turn, Vivian Cross threw one last blade at my pride. She lifted her head high, voice cold and dripping contempt across the yard. "Cheap trash like you will never beat me." Every word hit my ears like a sentence. Not just a threat, it was naked humiliation. A declaration that she despised my roots, my skin, my very presence in this neighborhood. I felt blood rush to my temples, my fists clenching so tight I could hear the joints crack. In that moment, I stared into the arrogant eyes lit up with satisfaction, convinced she had just shamed her enemy, and I knew Vivian had just exposed herself completely. The whole street seemed to hold its breath. A few more windows cracked open, silhouettes shifting behind curtains. I knew some of the neighbors had heard everything, yet they stayed silent. That silence was like armor for Vivian, a shield that made her even bolder. I bit my lip, forcing myself not to throw back the venom building in my throat, because I knew that's exactly what she wanted, for me to lose control, so she could spin it all back and paint me as the aggressor in front of the entire community. But restraint does not mean surrender. In my mind, every detail she had inflicted was stringing itself into an invisible indictment. The absurd fine, the ATV's roaring engine each morning, the vile rumors spreading through the neighborhood, and now this open insult. Everything was piling up, pushing me to the edge. I felt something erupt in my chest, no longer just anger, but a cold, deliberate resolve. Vivian stood there, that smug smirk still fixed on her face. She believed she was untouchable, convinced no one would dare challenge her. I turned toward the front door, not answering her insult. But with every step I took, I could feel her mocking laugh echo behind me like claws scratching against the last layer of patience. I closed the door, leaned against it, and shut my eyes for a few seconds. I knew then the line had been drawn. As the door shut behind me, the ATV engine screamed to life, its roar echoing down the street. Vivian's triumphant laughter mingled with the piercing sound, driving home the challenge. I walked straight into the garage, the neon light casting a sharp glow over the workbench strewn with wires, circuit breakers, and the schematics I had prepared. In that moment, I knew my decision was right. I wouldn't just defend, I would retaliate. Elena ran in from the living room, her face puzzled as she whispered, "Dad, what did she just say?" I didn't answer direct. I simply pulled her into a hug. I didn't want her young mind stained by the poison Vivian had just spewed. But inside, I made a silent vow. My daughter will not grow up in a community where insults are law, where bullies in power can trample someone's dignity without consequence. I sat down, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and began to write. Every word I put down wasn't for the HOA, it was to carve into memory everything that had happened. I wanted to preserve every detail, every word, so that when I strike back, there will be no room for denial. The evidence from Mr. Alvarez, the photos of the ATV plugged into my meter, all of it would be the spark to burn down the facade Vivian used as a shield. I organized the components, my hands moving with clarity. The plan was no longer just an idea, it was now a mission. Promise I would see through. Vivian believed the roar of her ATV was a declaration of power, but she had no idea it would become the torch burned down the arrogance she wore like armor. I sat still, taking in the silence of the garage so different from the noise outside. Out there, Vivian was performing for the neighborhood, but inside, I knew she had just stepped into her own trap. And next time that stolen current runs through her cord, the one left regretting it won't be me. One familiar question beat in my mind, like a drum urging me forward. Do I keep enduring or do I strike now? If you were me, would you stay quiet or strike back? Share your thoughts in the comments. After the night I was publicly humiliated in front of the entire lakeside community, I sat in the garage for a long time, the dim yellow light from the ceiling casting a stretched, distorted shadow of me across the cold cement floor. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the ticking wall clock and the scattered echoes in my mind, the morning roars of the ATV, the sharp thuds of violation notices hitting the mailbox, the venomous whispers during HOA meetings, and finally, Vivian Cross's contemptuous gaze paired with her blatant insult. All of it blended into a simmering mess, quiet yet razor-edged, like a blade slicing through my dignity and sense of self. These wounds had no shape, but they left deep marks that could never be scrubbed clean. And in that moment, I knew, if I kept backing down, she wouldn't stop. She would keep coming, push me further, stepping over me, with the self-appointed authority and blind support of a community too accustomed to its false peace. And if I allowed that, Elena, my daughter, would grow up in a place where justice was a cheap joke, where truth had no voice, and where people chose silence out of fear of becoming the next target. I stood up and opened the old electrical toolbox. Inside were rolls of copper wire darkened by time, circuit breakers, circuit board, capacitors once used for home repairs, now they looked like weapons. I pulled out paper and pen and began sketching the blueprint for a custom circuit breaker. The idea had taken root days ago, but now it wasn't just a passing thought. It was a plan, a specific one. The breaker would attach directly to the main electric meter, programmed to detect abnormal fluctuations in current, especially those drawn out by illegitimate means. I reviewed the electrical principles I knew, mentally calculating values like an engineer back in a factory. Key was ensuring the system remained completely harmless to all legitimate in-home usage, absolutely safe for Elena, for me, but if any device attempted to steal power, it would trigger an immediate response. A reverse surge strong enough to fry any unauthorized device, and if that device happened to be the ATV charger, a system not built to withstand voltage anomalies, the result would be unmistakable. I stared at the finished blueprint, my hands slightly trembling from the tension. This wasn't just engineering, it was a strategy. For hours, I stayed hunched over, connecting wires, mounting boards, tightening screws, measuring voltage with a multimeter. After each test, I checked everything again, then started over. I couldn't afford a mistake. One misstep could turn me from someone seeking justice into someone being arrested. Sweat soaked through my shirt, streamed down from my temples to my neck, dripping steadily onto the work. I wiped it away, barely pausing. I wasn't fixing something, I was building a trap, and the prey was Vivian Cross's unchecked arrogance. When I flipped the breaker and saw the indicator light blink just as designed, I froze for a moment. Then I smiled, not the grin of triumph, but the smile of someone who finally holds something to fight back with. I whispered to myself, low and cold, "You like free electricity? I'll give you a real electric party." In the days that followed, checking the circuit every morning, I allowed no margin for error. Sometimes I stood behind the curtain, silently watching Elena studying at the dining table, her hair messy, legs swinging. I reminded myself, this plan must never harm her. But I also reminded myself, I have to show Vivian what it means to exploit someone. On Tuesday night, I decided to call Mr. Alvarez, the elderly neighbor living alone at the end of the block, the only person who had spoken to me after that humiliating HOA meeting. I showed him the schematic, explained how the circuit worked, hiding nothing. He stared at me for a long moment, eyes clouded with something between empathy and apprehension. "Marcus, you're playing with fire," he said, his voice low and smoky. "But I get it. Maybe fire's the only thing that can burn away the darkness she's cast over this place." He squeezed my shoulder, not hard, but with weight. "If you're going to do this, make sure you're ready for what comes next." I nodded. I knew Vivian Cross wouldn't take being humiliated quietly. I knew she'd twist every rule, every HOA connection she had to retaliate. But I also knew, the moment that red ATV burned out plugging into an illegal source, she would no longer be able to hide behind her community protector facade, and that would be the turning point. A concrete, undeniable event. A visual stronger than any excuse. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, replaying every wiring step, every tiny detail. I imagined the ATV charging, then stalling, then smoking, popping, and hissing like a silent film scene full of symbolism. I saw Vivian stumbling out of her house, pale-faced, while the neighbors started murmuring, maybe even pointing fingers at her for the first time. I saw Elena running to the door, looking up at me, her eyes full of trust, the kind of trust I feared would vanish if I kept staying silent. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen behind the rows of model homes, but the sky was starting to brighten. I stepped out into the yard, looking at the fence where that dangling cable once hung like a wound. I took a deep breath, turned back into the garage, wiped my hands, and checked the breaker one last time. Every motion firm, like a ritual before battle. This wasn't a test. This wasn't practice. Today was real. The sound of the ATV echoed in the distance, its engine slicing through the still morning air like a war drum announcing the hour of battle. My heart pounded, but it wasn't fear anymore. I stood, stepped out onto the porch, eyes locked on the road where Vivian would soon appear, and I felt no hesitation. This time, when she plugs in that cord, no one will be laughing, and she'll be the last to hear the crackle of justice catching fire. Late in the afternoon, the last light of day spilled like slow-flowing honey, casting a golden hue across the trees in the front yard. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, their shadows swaying softly over the cold stone path, but no amount of serenity calmed my mind. I stood still in the yard, eyes locked on the power meter where a black cord once again draped brazenly across the fence like a crude insult. The cable wasn't long, it wasn't thick, but to me, it was a symbol of humiliation I couldn't swallow. At the other end, Vivian Cross's glossy red ATV quietly drank electricity from my house, its charger blinking a steady, sharp blue light, as if mocking me with every pulse. I clenched my fists, my nails digging deep into flesh. My breath grew heavy, heart pounding, felt like a tidal surge rising from within, the buildup of days being pressed into a corner. But this time, I didn't storm out, didn't yank the cable, didn't shout in her face. I'd come too far to fall back on instinct. Everything had been prepared. This was no longer a personal clash. This was the end of a long, relentless push into submission. I slipped back inside, closed the door, and gently pulled the living room curtain. In the dim light, I watched like a soldier monitoring enemy lines. Vivian stood there, arms folded across her chest, her gaze sliding over the ATV as if admiring a trophy. Occasionally, she glanced toward my house, as if making sure I could see the entire scene, the act of theft laid bare, bold, and smug. She didn't just want the power. She wanted to claim dominion, a silent message. I'm here, I do what I want, and you can't stop me. I turned from the window, slowly descending into the garage. The small room was so quiet I could hear the hum of current coursing through the wires. The warm yellow light glowed against the rough cement floor, casting a crooked reflection of my figure. I stepped toward the panel, where the emergency switch sat waiting. My hand gripped the lever, the skin slick with sweat. My heartbeat thundered so loud it felt like it was slamming against my chest, rattling my ribs. Everything inside me was pulled taut like a string ready to snap. I whispered, not loud, not for anyone to hear, just a reminder to myself, or perhaps to the universe that had been silently watching. Tonight, she'll scream in front of everyone. Night began to fall, draping the neighborhood in an eerie stillness. The houses seemed to hold their breath, lights flicking off one by one, though a few kitchens still cast pale yellow glows onto their driveways. I knew that behind those glass panes, eyes were watching. No one spoke, no one intervened, but they were there. They were the quiet witnesses in this standoff, people who lived in fear, who avoided conflict, yet longed desperately to see justice truly carried out just once. The ATV kept roaring in pulses, steady like the heartbeat of provocation. It was no longer just a mechanical sound. It was the sound of invasion, of distorted power. I closed my eyes for a moment to envision the scene about to unfold. In my mind, the red vehicle shook. A soft pop cracked the silence. White smoke rose from the engine. Sparks burst like electric fireworks, followed by Vivian Cross's piercing scream, not the commanding president anymore, but a thief caught red-handed. I imagined neighbors pouring out, surrounding her, eyes wide in shock, whispers shifting direction. And me, I said nothing, needed no defense. I stood there, calm, the last one still holding the line in a sea of falsehood. I took a deep breath. Every muscle in my body tightened. This was the peak. No more days of planning or testing. This was the real fight. The breaker circuit had been tested dozens of times. The switch is installed discreetly, completely safe for the home system. I wasn't sabotaging. I was drawing a line. And anyone who crossed that line would have to pay the price. Thought of Elena. She was sleeping upstairs, peaceful as if the world outside didn't exist. I had shielded shielded her just enough to keep her from hearing the worst words, from feeling the weight of judging eyes, but I couldn't protect her from everything. She'd grown up surrounded by cruel whispers about her father, had watched him stay silent under pressure, and I knew though she never said it, she was asking herself, does justice exist? Does silence help anything? Tonight, I wasn't just setting a trap. I was planting a lesson for my daughter that sometimes resistance is the right choice, and that her father wasn't a coward. I sat on the small wooden stool beside the electrical panel, eyes locked on the indicator light. I didn't rush. I waited for the exact moment when the ATV had been drawing power long enough for the circuit to detect and respond, when the act could no longer be denied. Outside, the wind blew softly, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and a hint of moisture. Everything felt strangely peaceful, like the hush before a storm breaks. I sat motionless, but inside me was a storm. This wasn't just about teaching Vivian a lesson. It was about tearing off polished skin she wore over her tyranny. A burning vehicle wasn't the goal. The goal was truth. The goal was a shift in the collective perception of this neighborhood. I gripped the switch tightly. My eyes were steady now, my heart no longer shaken. One thought remained in my mind. Tonight, the truth will no longer be hidden. I was ready. And when that moment came, when the flames burst to life, I knew there would be no turning back. Vivian Cross would have to face the consequences not just for the theft, but for the arrogance, for her blind belief in power. I wouldn't need to shout. I wouldn't need to justify. The fire would speak for me, and when morning came, this neighborhood would never be the same. The night was steeped in silence, the suffocating quiet of a neighborhood that seemed peaceful but was, in truth, simmering with unspoken conflict. Outside, the sky was ink black, lit only by the streetlights casting pale reflections on the cold asphalt, stretching the shadows of bare trees like arms reaching up from the earth. In that dead stillness, only the soft buzz of the ATV charger echoed through the yard, a familiar but unsettling sound, like a ticking clock counting down to the final moment of reckoning. I sat in the garage, dim yellow light from the overhead bulb, casting a crooked shadow of me across the cold cement floor. My hand rested on the breaker switch, thumb twitching slightly, like a soldier awaiting the order to fire. My breath shortened with each heart, not from fear, but from pressure. My whole body was a bowstring drawn to its limit, ready to snap at the slightest touch. I closed my eyes, focusing every sense on the hum of electricity, a background score, a signal that the cycle of silent theft was still turning. Then, just as I had calculated, faint hiss came from beyond the fence, not loud, but sharp enough to tell me the circuit had begun to react. A foreign current was a hidden theft system exposed by the mechanism I had built with my own hands. In a flash, a spark flared like a blade slicing clean through the heavy dark. From the shadows, I saw the red ATV jolt violently. The charger lights blinked madly, then suddenly exploded in a dry, piercing pop, like the scream of a truth finally released. The light burst like fireworks, not in celebration, but in punishment. Flames erupted from the charging, racing across the frame like a wild beast unleashed from its cage. Vivian Cross stood right beside it, her eyes wide with disbelief. She screamed, hoarse and panicked, nothing like the sharp tones she usually used. "My car! Oh my God! Help!" Cries echoed through the neighborhood, crashing through walls, shattering the silence. No more arrogance, no more smugness of a self-crowned queen, only a woman exposed before the crowd, raw and desperate. The fire blazed, blackening the air around it. Thick smoke coiled upward, carried by the wind, the stench of melting plastic, stabbing through every half-closed window. A light came on in one house, then another, then a third. One by one, porch lights flickered to life in a chain reaction, followed by hurried footsteps, doors slamming open, dogs barking wildly, and the rising murmur of neighbors calling to each other. The entire neighborhood had awakened into a burning nightmare. I stepped out of the garage and stood on the porch, the glow from the fire casting flickering light across my face, stretching my shadow long across the yard and diagonally onto the white wall like a declaration. Folded my arms across my chest, eyes fixed on the scene unfolding. The red ATV engulfed in flames like a torch in the middle of the neighborhood. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence was the answer. A wordless indictment that weighed heavier than any argument ever could. Vivian was still there, spinning in place between the flames and the crowd. Her hair was a tangled mess. Makeup was streaked with sweat and tears. She wasn't screaming about her vehicle anymore. She was screaming over the collapse of the image she had spent so long crafting. "Someone please. My car. It's gone." Her voice cracked like shattering glass, echoing as the plea of someone who had just lost everything. But no one rushed to help. No one burst out of their door with a fire extinguisher. Some dialed 911. Others pulled out their phones and hit record, flashlights blinking rhythmically. The same faces that once turned away while I was being humiliated now stared at Vivian with a mix of shock and maybe a touch of satisfaction. I heard the whispers, low but sharp as blade. "I told you she was stealing power from Marcus's house. I saw the cable going over the fence. She deserved that. Steals power, acts like a queen." I didn't move. There was no triumphant grin, no insults hurled back, only a calm, cold stillness inside me. I hadn't waited for this moment out of spite. I waited for justice, the very thing that had been twisted, buried, and bartered away with tricks and and venomous words in this play. Tonight, I wasn't retaliating. Vivian had lit the fuse herself, the one she'd secretly planted beneath the foundation of her own kingdom. The fire truck sirens wailed in the distance. Red and blue lights flickered across the houses, casting wild shadows like a scrambled screen. By the time the firefighters arrived, flames had already devoured the seat, leaving behind a twisted, blackened metal frame. Vivian had collapsed onto the curb, arms wrapped around her head, muttering, "This can't be happening, can't be." I looked around and caught Mr. Alvarez's gaze. He stood in his doorway, eyes deep and clear. He didn't speak. He simply nodded slowly, deliberately. It wasn't congratulation nor blind support. It was recognition. The truth had finally spoken. I turned and walked back into the house, closed the door. The murmurs outside lingered, but no one turned their back on me now. Tonight, Vivian Cross was no longer the one shaping the rules. She was the one being exposed. I sat down on the living room chair, facing the stack of citation letters that had once stolen my sleep. Now, they were nothing more than silent sheets of paper, failed attempts to crush someone who refused to bow. I knew the fight wasn't over. Vivian would lash out. She'd assign blame, rally allies, but the tide had turned. I was no longer the easy target. I was the one they had to reckon with. And as the flames outside began to fade, I allowed myself a quiet smile. Not of victory, but because, for the first time in months, justice had spoken not in word, but in light no one could deny. And that, at last, was the first crack in the fall of Vivian Cross. The flames had just been extinguished, smoke still swirling, the stench of burnt plastic clinging to every gust of wind blowing through the neighborhood. The crowd had yet to disperse when Vivian Cross sprang up, her face flushed with a mix of panic and fury. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice hoarse, but still forced into a shout for all to hear. "He sabotaged! He killed my car!" Her scream tore through the already thick air, heavy with black smoke. Eyes turned to me at once, some narrowed in suspicion, others silently waiting. I didn't move. I stood on my porch, arms crossed over my chest. My gaze remained cold, unflinching, without reaction or defense. I knew what Vivian was trying to do, flip the narrative, paint me as the aggressor instead of the victim, right in front of everyone. She didn't stop. Cries spiraled into desperation. "He set me up. He tried to hurt me. This is a criminal act. I want him arrested. Now." Her voice cracked, but cheek pushing, trying to overwhelm the crowd with volume alone. Then, a voice cut through the noise from behind the crowd. "Don't believe her so fast. I have proof." The crowd turned, and I saw Mr. Alvarez slowly step out of the shadows, holding up his old phone. The slender old man, hair silver and tousled in the streetlight, had eyes that burned sharp, and a voice steadier than I'd ever heard. Vivian froze for a split second, then snapped, "Don't listen to him. That old man's on his side too." But Alvarez stood firm. He raised the phone, and the screen lit up with a clear video from his security camera. Vivian was unmistakable, her figure, her face, her hand connecting the cord from my power meter to her red ATV. Undeniable, unedited. The crowd stirred, murmurs rippling through it. Few people sighed, and others shook their heads. I clearly heard a man whisper, "God, she did it herself." Tried to blame Marcus. Vivian's face went pale. Her eyes darted, desperate for a way out. She stammered, That's fake. Someone must have edited." But before she could finish, Alvarez delivered the final blow. He opened a gallery of photos taken days earlier, each showing her brazenly plugging in the cable. Different angles, different days, but every image confirmed the same thing. Vivian was the thief. The mood shifted rapidly. If the crowd had once been torn, now the truth was irrefutable. The suspicious glances turned to judgment. They looked at Vivian, and no longer saw a trustworthy woman, but a shameless liar. I stayed silent. I didn't need to say anything. The truth had spoken for itself, and it was a sharper indictment than any words I could have offered. Vivian screamed one last time, her voice breaking, "You'll all regret this. I won't let this go." But her cry echoed into the night with no weight. It was the sound of someone already sinking. No one answered. Many turned and walked away, and others stayed behind, shaking their heads in disappointment. Mr. Alvarez stepped closer, placing a light hand on my shoulder, his voice low but resolute. "From now on, she won't fool anyone. You showed them the truth." I gave a slight nod, my eyes still locked on Vivian. She was backing away toward her house, her steps unsteady, her face contorted with a mixture of rage and shame. I knew the battle wasn't over. From this moment on, the balance had shifted. The arrow of accusation she aimed at me had turned around and struck her squarely instead. I turned back inside, closed the door, and felt a cold calm settle over me. The storm hadn't passed, but now I held the advantage, and this time, truth was on my side. The entire neighborhood crowded around the yard as the flames on the ATV were finally extinguished, smoke still billowing thick into the air. Phones were still raised, screen lights casting a glow over tense, furious faces. Vivian Cross struggled to stay afloat in the sea of witnesses, her mouth still running, desperate to shift all the blame onto me. But the crowd was no longer so quick to believe her. The video from Mr. Alvarez's camera had made the truth undeniable. Someone in the crowd spoke up, not loud, but enough for many to hear. "Steals power and screams like the victim." The words sliced through the lingering silence like a blade. Heads nodded, lips curled smiled in disgust. Then came the whispers, spreading like ripples. I saw the cord draped over the fence once but didn't say anything. No wonder my elect bill was off last month. Let's see who still defends her now. Fragmented comment, but together they formed a verdict. Vivian was guilty. I stood tall on my front steps, eyes forward, refusing to look away. As neighbors' glances swept across me, some still hesitant, others shifting toward understanding, I let the silence hold for a few more seconds before speaking. My voice was steady, but it carried. This is my electricity, and this is my just. No shouting, no long speeches. The sentence rang out through the dense air, silencing the murmurs. It wasn't just meant for Vivian, it was aimed at the entire community that had long lived in fear. I could feel their gazes shift toward me, no longer filled with doubt, but with acknowledgement. Vivian froze, face drained of color, then flushed bright red. She looked like she wanted to speak, but her mouth only moved soundlessly. In that moment, she stood fully exposed, no longer the orchestrator of HOA power, but someone whose true nature had been laid bare. The shadow she once cast over the neighborhood had shriveled into nothing undone by a single sentence and a pile of irrefutable evidence. A few neighbors stepped toward me. A middle-aged man gave a slight nod, murmuring, "You did what no one else dared for years. She has nowhere left to hide now." A woman pulled her young child closer, standing nearer to me, her gaze no longer wary but trusting. Meanwhile, Vivian kept backing toward her front door, her steps unsteady. The vile rumors she had spread, the violation notices she had enforced, all of it was collapsing like a sandcastle under a wave. People weren't whispering about me anymore. They were whispering about her. No one stepped in to shield her. She stood exposed beneath the collective gaze of the neighborhood. I drew a long, quiet breath, then turned and walked back inside. The door closed behind me, but the murmurs outside still slipped through the crack. They no longer weighed on me. I knew the battle wasn't over, but as of tonight, the balance had shifted, and I had planted a truth in the minds of my neighbors, one no one could deny anymore. Justice may come late, but when it arrives, it stands with those who dare to speak. News of the ATV fire and the video from Mr. Alvarez's security camera spread quickly throughout Lakeside. In just one night, every filthy rumor Vivian Cross had sown to humiliate me was swept away, replaced by real stories of what she had done over the years. People no longer avoided the topic, no longer whispered behind closed doors. They began speaking openly about their own experiences of being oppressed. At the emergency meeting held the very next day, Mr. Alvarez brought out a folder he had kept safe for years. The pages were yellowed, clipped together with photographs and handwritten notes. His hands trembled as he opened it, but his voice was clear and firm. He pointed to each piece of evidence: citations that unfairly targeted families of color, instances where Vivian had rewritten HOA rules to force immigrant residents into conforming to absurd standards, and petitions she had crushed without mercy. The room was silent for several minutes. Then whispers rose, growing louder and sharper by the second. Residents who had stayed silent for so long now stood up together. A middle-aged man held up an old citation, shouting, "She fined my family just flying a different colored flag. Quiet for years. Enough is enough." A black woman clutched her child, sobbing as she recounted being threatened with eviction unless she changed her lifestyle to fit the standard. Vivian sat in the chair reserved for the board, face pale, eyes unfocused. She tried to interrupt, but the wave of objections drowned her out. No one wanted to hear her anymore. The room erupted with chants. Remove her. Remove her now. No one feared her false authority anymore. I sat in the front row, quietly watching. Everything I had endured was now being spoken aloud by my neighbors. They were furious because they had been silent far too long. And now, with the truth laid bare, they were reclaiming their voices. I saw in their eyes not just anger, but a rekindling of hope. Hope that this community could finally change. Vivian jumped to her feet, her voice hoarse with desperation. "You'll regret this. Without me, this place will fall apart." But no one was listening anymore. An elderly resident slammed his hand on the table, his voice ringing out, "We don't need someone who turns rules into weapons. We need a real community." Amid the chants for her removal, I looked at Vivian and saw no trace of the arrogance she once wielded like a crown. In front of me stood a trembling figure, surrounded by truth and collective outrage, and I knew the facade she had spent years building had shattered beyond repair. Lakeside was witnessing a turning point, and for the first time, it wasn't Vivian deciding the direction. It was the very people she had tried to silence. The air in the meeting room grew heavier by the minute, every seat now empty as residents stood one by one to speak out. Citation letters were held up, each penalty document with its absurd reasoning exposed right in front of Vivian Cross. An elderly man, hands trembling, clutched a notice he'd received for parking too close to the curb, his voice catching as he recounted how he'd once sold a keepsake just to pay the fine. Another woman, eyes brimming with tears, recalled how Vivian had threatened to report her family to immigration if they didn't change the way they decorated their front yard. Stories poured out like waves. One person stood, then another, each with years of resentment rising to the surface. What was once a dry, formulaic HOA meeting filled with numbers and clauses had become a public tribunal. Silence and avoidance had vanished, replaced by an unrelenting stream of accusation. Cries for justice echoed through the room, fists slammed on tables, and voices declared they had endured enough. Vivian sat at the head of the table, her face drained of color, eyes unfocused. She had once ruled this room with a single clearing of her throat, but now, even her shouts couldn't pierce the uproar. She tried to interject, to raise her voice in denial, but all of it was swallowed by the rising tide of fury. No excuse could cover anything now. "We let you manipulate us for too long," a black man declared as he stood, voice steady. "But today, it ends." Applause broke out across the room, followed by resounding cheers. The chants calling for her removal echoed louder than any resolution Vivian had ever forced through. I remained seated in the front row, silent. Everything I had ever wanted to say had already been spoken by the very community that once looked away. Every action Vivian had taken, every decision cloaked in the name of preserving values, was now being stripped bare. The meeting was no longer her court. It had become a reckoning, a public demand for voices long denied. Vivian shot up, trying to steady herself, her voice shaking. "You need me. Without me, this neighborhood will fall apart." But no one believed her anymore. Her words rang hollow, powerless, lost amid a flood of rejection. For the first time, I saw Vivian truly cornered. No more respectful glances, no more compliant nods, only collective outrage, burning too fiercely to be extinguished. The woman who once declared herself the law of Lakeside now stood surrounded by truth, and there was no way out. I leaned back in my chair, watching it all with a cold calm. I knew this wasn't just a defeat in a meeting, it was the beginning of her downfall. And once a community awakens, there's no room left for the darkness to return. The next morning, police returned to the neighborhood accompanied by a team of city code enforcement officers. They weren't there to investigate anymore, they were there to deliver an official verdict. An officer read each clause of the penalty notice aloud, his voice clear and deliberate. A heavy financial fine for Vivian Cross for electricity theft, causing a short circuit and endangering public safety. The cold, formal words echoed through the meeting room, each one falling like a hammer blow on the HOA chair she had clung to for so many years. It didn't stop there. The HOA records were updated on the spot. Violations that had once been buried, minimized during closed-door meetings, were now laid out in full. Every note, every detail pointed clearly to how Vivian had manipulated her power, twisting regulations into weapons. It was all in writing now, unalterable, undeniable. Outside, the charred ATV was hoisted onto a flatbed truck. The sound of metal scraping against asphalt screeched through the air, a jarring noise that made some people flinch. What was once a smug symbol of Vivian's dominance now stood as a twisted, blackened frame, a humiliating monument to the downfall of an abuser of power. I watched from my porch, a strange calm settling in my chest. No more accusations were needed. That image said it all. Neighbors gathered quietly, eyes following the service truck as it rolled out of the neighborhood. Some murmured, "Well deserved," then nodded. A few snapped photos, as if to preserve the moment a false idol finally crumbled. I spotted Mr. Alvarez standing nearby, his aged face solemn but his eyes gleaming. He had waited a long time for this day, and now, he was here to see it. Vivian no longer dared to show her face. She avoided eye contact, retreating into her home like a shadow. Her HOA chairmanship was revoked right then and there during the emergency meeting. No drawn-out voting necessary. Everyone stood, raised their hands to remove her unanimously, without a single opposing vote. For the first time, Lakeside made a decision together. I sat quietly in my living room, watching the lingering wisps of smoke through the window, and thought to myself, justice had arrived. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was enough. Enough to remind everyone that no one stands above the rule. The one who once claimed to be the law now had to bow before the wording of an official citation and the scornful eyes of the community. That day, Lakeside changed. People left the meeting room with lighter steps, as if a weight that had crushed them for years had finally been lifted. I walked back home, and Elena ran into my arms, her face lit up. I gently patted her head and silently promised that from now on she would no longer have to ask, "Why do they hate us?" I had shown her something she needed to see. Truth always wins in the end, and justice, though late, never forget. The meeting concluded with a decision unlike any in Lakeside HOA history. After the reports were read, Mr. Alvarez's evidence was presented, and the police formally documented the violations. Every resident present raised their hand to vote. Not one voice defended Vivian Cross. Not a single hesitant glance remained. Unanimously, the neighborhood agreed she was to step down immediately. The HOA secretary read the motion of removal aloud, her voice steady and uninterrupted. Vivian Cross is hereby stripped of her position as HOA president, effective immediately. The sentence was short, but it landed in the room like a blade, severing the last strand of authority Vivian had clung to for years. Applause followed, not raucous or celebratory, but a crisp, collective release, the sound of a community shaking off its chain. Vivian sat frozen, her hands clenched until they turned white. She tried to speak, to object, but her throat closed up, yielding only a few broken syllables. The aura she once used to command the neighborhood had vanished. There was no deference now, no fearful glances, only cold, unflinching stares, heavy with contempt. As the meeting dissolved, people filtered out of the room. Some came to shake my hand. Others approached Mr. Alvarez to thank him for safeguarding the evidence. Meanwhile, Vivian staggered toward the door like someone who'd lost her sense of direction. She shuffled into the dying afternoon light, her blonde hair disheveled, her face hollowed and drawn a far cry from the proud HOA queen everyone once knew. The reputation she had built on fear dissolved in an instant. Her name now passed from mouth to mouth, not in whispers of caution, but in mocking tone. The woman who thought she was the law now, her name's printed in the violation report. She looked down on everyone, and now she's the joke. The laughter was faint, cutting, a mix of satisfaction and long-awaited vindication, echoing through the neighborhood. Down the narrow street leading home, Vivian walked beneath the weight of dozens of watchful eyes. Some didn't bother to greet her. Others deliberately shook their heads as she passed. In this community, she was already dead in spirit, reduced to a remnant of authoritarian rule. The burnt ATV, towed away the day before, had become a symbol of her collapse. People spoke of it like a punchline, a vivid reminder that arrogance, unchecked, always ends in self-destruction. I watched from a distance, silently. There was nothing left to say, everything was clear. The woman who once screamed, "I am the law," was now just a pitiful shadow, a punchline in the very neighborhood she once ruled. I knew this wasn't the absolute end, but the greatest battle was over. And this time, justice hadn't just unseated a president, it had stripped away the entire illusion of power Vivian Cross had hidden behind for so long. The day Vivian Cross packed her things and left Lakeside, the neighborhood fell into an uncanny quiet. No more morning ATV roars, no more heavy footsteps and shouting echoing through meeting. A small moving truck pulled up in front of her house, and a few workers carried out box after box, but not a single neighbor came to see her off. Windows cracked open, shadows of people standing behind them, but there were no waves, no goodbyes. Vivian stepped out with her head down, shoulders slumped, her gait heavy as if burdened by the weight of her own past. I stood on my porch, watching the scene unfold. What I felt wasn't gloating satisfaction. It was a cold, clean finality. Months of oppression, vicious rumors, and absurd fines, all of it ended in this moment. The woman who once shouted, "I am the law," now had to leave in silence, under the quiet gaze of the very community she used to rule. A few neighbors whispered to each other, their words loud enough to reach my ears. "She stole Marcus's electricity, this is what she gets." That whisper wasn't just an observation, it was a distilled summary of the tragedy Vivian brought upon herself. People no longer feared her name, no longer flinched when she was mentioned. Instead, they spoke of her as a cautionary tale, a reminder that false power always collapses when truth emerges. The truck rolled away slowly, leaving behind an empty house. The front door shut in silence. The walls no longer hung with HOA command signs. The yard bare, stripped of life. For most, the house would soon have a new owner, but for me, it would always mark a dark chapter in this neighborhood, a time when the whole community lived under a heavy hand, surveilled, and threatened. That evening, I walked the familiar street. Neighbors greeted me this time, their expressions more relaxed. One paused to shake my hand and said quietly, "You did the right thing." I nodded, unwilling to take credit because the truth was simple. Vivian had destroyed herself with her own greed and arrogance. I had only stood up and refused to stay silent any longer. Vivian's house disappeared into the dusk, but the image of her bowed head, walking away in silence, stayed burned into my memory. It was the clearest proof of an inevitable ending. Someone who once roared, who once humiliated others, is now left without a single kind glance behind her. I returned home, my steps lighter than ever. My daughter ran out to meet me, her eyes bright, her smile wide. I bent down to hug her, and in that moment, I realized we would now live in a different neighborhood, one no longer shadowed by Vivian Cross. And that, more than anything, was the real victory. After Vivian Cross left Lakeside, the air in the community shifted completely. People still mentioned her, but not with fear or restraint. They spoke of her like an old story, a bitterly funny anecdote, and the image of the burnt-out ATV became the symbol of her downfall. On quiet mornings over coffee on the porch, the old men in the neighborhood often chuckle dryly when it comes up. "Remember the day that ATV blew up like fireworks? Hard to forget a scene like that." Kids riding their bikes around whisper about the haunted red bike, turning it into a story to scare one another. Adults occasionally point to the empty patch of land where the vehicle used to sit, shrugging as they say, "That's the price of greed." The blackened metal frame that was dragged away from the scene now only exists in collective memory, but it still serves as a lasting reminder. Whenever someone complains about unreasonable HOA rules, someone else will answer, "Careful, or you'll end up like Vivian writing laws for others while breaking them yourself." That incident is no longer just a private dispute between her and me, but a shared lesson etched into the conscience of the entire community. I often catch whispers behind my back when I walk with Elena. "That's Marcus's house, the guy Vivian stole electricity from. He's still here. She's the one who disappeared." There's no longer doubt in those voices, only recognition. I smile faintly, never needing to say a word, because the truth stands firm in everyone's memory. The people of Lakeside have started living more freely, fly whatever flags they want, arrange their flowers however they like, and open their doors with more warmth. The fear that once loomed over every house is slowly fading. Stories about Vivian are no longer dark threats, but cautionary tales, a reminder that they will never again let another tyrant take control of their community. I still remember the look in Mr. Alvarez's eyes when we met again a few days later. He sat on his old wooden chair on the porch, his voice low but filled with quiet satisfaction. "We made it out, Marcus. A dark chapter has closed." I nodded, eyes drifting toward Vivian's now empty house, its windows sealed tight, no lights glowing inside. That sentence echoed in me. Truly, everything that once weighed heavily had been lifted. I no longer flinched when opening the mailbox, fearing another absurd citation. Elena no longer froze in fear at the sight of Vivian standing at our gate, and I, at last, could breathe the clean air of a community that respects one another. A dark chapter had closed. No one wants to live in the shadow of the past, but no one has forgotten the cost of that lesson. The image of that charred ATV still lingers in memory, a warning to value justice and to speak out when it matters. And to me, it remains proof truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually blaze through like a fire no one can extinguish. After the day Vivian Cross left Lakeside, the neighborhood felt like it had slipped into a new skin. The heavy, cautious atmosphere began to lift. People no longer walked through the community gates with their heads down. Instead, there were polite smiles and friendly nods. They no longer flinched at the sight of an HOA board member doing rounds, no longer haunted by the stiff, pale notices waiting in their mailbox. One morning, as I was out front trimming the hedges, I saw Mr. Johnson coming up from the end of the block. He reached out his hand calloused, firm, and steady. "You did what we didn't dare," he said, voice low but full of sincerity. I took his hand and saw in his eyes not just gratitude, but a kind of release. A little later, Mrs. Harriet, who had stayed silent during the meeting out of fear of being fined, came by too. She smiled faintly, her eyes tinged with something like embarrassment. "I owe you an apology, Marcus. I've known she was wrong for a long time, but I never had the courage to say it. Because of you, I feel like I can hold my head up again." I simply nodded. She didn't need to say anything more. Each day, more people came by. Some shook my hand, some clapped me on the shoulder, some just smiled, but their eyes were bright. The thanks came from all directions, always circling back to the same idea: you stood up for us. I heard it over and over, but it never weighed heavily. Because I knew I hadn't done it to be a hero, I'd done it to clear a path so the whole community could reclaim the voice it had lost. I always responded with the same simple line, and I wanted them to remember it: we're strongest when we stand together. That made a few people go quiet, then nod in agreement. I knew they understood, because no one alone could have taken down Vivian. If Mr. Alvarez hadn't provided evidence, if the others hadn't risen up during the meeting, I would have been just one more voice drowned out. From that day on, real changes began to show. The community gates were decorated with flowers planted by the residents themselves, not mandated by the board. Children played freely in the yards, their laughter echoing where silence used to sit. A small neighborhood gathering was organized, everyone brought food, and for the first time in ages, it felt like a true celebration. Elena and I sat among them, and I watched her laugh and play, no longer hiding behind me the way she once did. Mr. Alvarez came over and raised a plastic to mine. "Marcus, you started this. But you were right, none of it could have happened without all of us. For the first time in years, I feel like Lakeside is truly a community." His voice was rough, but I could hear the joy behind it. I smiled, letting my eyes sweep across the crowd. I saw Mrs. Harriet beaming. Mr. Johnson teaching the kids how to play tug of war. People who used to shrink back now, speaking freely and laughing. I thought to myself, this renewal, this was the real reward. Not that Vivian had been removed, not that the ATV had gone up in flame, but that the people who once lived with their heads down could now stand tall, looking one another in the eye, under the full light of day. Lakeside was reborn, not through rigid rule, but through courage awakened. And I knew that from now on, this community would never again allow a tyrant to choke its collective voice. The small gathering on the shared lawn stretched on until the streetlights flickered on. Folding tables were lined up, covered with dishes brought by each family. The atmosphere was lively, a stark contrast to the heavy years that came before. Adults laughed and talked, children ran in circles, their bright laughter blending with the clink of glasses. I sat in the middle of it all, clearly sensing how every face had softened, placed now with ease, as if they'd all just set down a heavy burden. Elena sat beside me, her smile wide as friends invited her to play tag. She no longer flinched at the mention of the HOA. I looked at her, saw her joy, and felt something ease in my chest. The fight I endured wasn't just to protect myself, but to make sure Elena could grow up in a community that respects people, one no longer shadowed by oppression. Mr. Alvarez came over, holding a plastic cup of soda, his gentle smile plain on his weathered face. He sat beside me, eyes gleaming with a joy I hadn't seen in him since I moved. He leaned slightly, speaking just loud enough for me to hear. "Now, this community is truly free." His words left me quiet for a moment. For years, he had lived silently, enduring and tolerating the oppression just to keep the peace. But today, he was the one speaking those bold words, affirming that we had truly won. I nodded and tapped my cup against his. In that moment, I felt it wasn't just me and Alvarez, but the entire neighborhood sharing in one common feeling: freedom. Other neighbors came by, some shaking my hand, some clapping me on the shoulder, each offering quiet thanks. "You did what we didn't dare. Thanks to you, we can finally stand straight. I just smiled, offering my usual reply. We're strongest when we stand together. And this time, I saw it in their eyes, they truly believed it. Night fell, and the gathering still hadn't ended. The kids sat in circles listening to grown-ups tell stories, while the adults discussed reorganizing the HOA with a new board fair and transparent. Everyone eagerly pitched in ideas, no longer afraid of being added to a violation list. Every voice was heard, and I knew that was the true spirit of a real community. I looked up at the night sky, stars scattered across the dark canvas. A clear thought echoed inside me. It wasn't the fire that burned down the ATV that marked the end, but this moment, when people dared to speak, dared to stand together. Vivian Cross had been dethroned, but more importantly, fear she once sowed had vanished, placed trust and unity. I smiled to myself, knowing the long battle hadn't been in vain. Elena would remember this night, would remember that her father didn't bow his head, and that a community is only truly strong when its people know how to rise together. Have you ever lived in a neighborhood controlled by someone abusing their power? Share your story. That morning, sunlight stretched across the dew-covered lawn, its rays slipping through the kitchen window and bathing the room in a warm glow. Elena ran out into the yard, her tousled hair falling over her shoulders, a radiant smile lighting up her face. She stopped, looked up at me, and said in a clear, bright voice, "Daddy, I'm not scared to go outside anymore." I froze, my heart tightening with a joy so simple yet so profound. Her words brought back memories of days past when she would cling to the back of my shirt whenever Vivian Cross appeared near the gate, or when she tugged on my sleeve in fear at the sight of the stolen power line strung across our fence. Elena once asked me, her eyes filled with worry, why we were so disliked. And now, in the same neighborhood, she could smile freely, untouched by fear. I walked over, knelt down to her level, and wrapped my arms around her small frame. "You're right, Elena," I whispered. "We're safe now." Her warmth against me made every hardship I had endured feel worthwhile. This wasn't just a fight to protect a utility meter, it was a fight to protect peace inside the heart of the child I loved most. We stepped into the yard together. I looked up at the electric meter on the wall, now clean and bright. No more cables stretched across, no more signs of trespass, only the steady ticking of numbers, proof that order and clarity had returned. I placed my hand on Elena's shoulder and pointed toward it. "You see that, Elena? That's our power. It belongs to us." She nodded, eyes glowing with trust and peace. Birdsong overhead, leaves rustling in the morning breeze. All of it formed a peaceful scene we hadn't felt in a long time. Elena darted around the grass, laughter echoing through the yard. I stood still, a calmness settling over me. Every one of her laughs was confirmation that a dark chapter had truly closed. I thought of the day Vivian was stripped of her title, her face lowered as she left the neighborhood without a single goodbye. It felt like a distant dream now, but the positive aftermath was real and vivid. Elena could now play freely in the front yard, no longer watched or whispered about. The shadow of oppression had lifted, making way for a new, clear morning. I exhaled slowly, but it was a breath of ease. I looked at my daughter and saw no fear in her eyes, but the unguarded innocence of childhood. I gently ran my hand over her head, imprinting this moment in my memory. There may still be hardships ahead, but I believed one thing with certainty. We had learned how to face them, without letting fear take hold again. Elena turned back and ran into my arms. "Daddy, I love our yard," she whispered. I leaned down, kissed her on the forehead, and said, "So do I, Elena, and I promise it'll always be a safe place for you." In that moment, I knew I hadn't just won a fight, I had reclaimed something far more important, peace for my daughter. Elena kept running around the yard, clear laughter ringing like silver chimes, blending into the soft morning sunlight. I sat down on the steps, quietly observing, my eyes following her every step. In that moment, I realized the battle I had just fought was no longer simply a confrontation with Vivian Cross. It had become a journey to protect something far simpler, peaceful yard where my daughter could play freely, without fear of being watched, threatened. When Elena finally stopped and ran over to me, her hair flying, cheeks flushed from the sun, I leaned forward. She wrapped her arms around my neck, breathing in the faint scent of sweat still clinging to my shirt. I placed a hand on her back, holding her in a warm embrace. In that moment, I whispered slowly and firmly into her ear, "Justice isn't something far away. It begins right here at home." She looked up at me with wide, dark eyes, not fully grasping the weight of my words, but still nodding with a bright smile. To her, justice might simply mean being able to play outside without being yelled at, being able to run and laugh without dodging contemptuous stares. To me, justice meant having stood up, having defended the boundaries of our home, so that an entire neighborhood turned the page to something new. I lifted my gaze to the electric meter on the wall. The numbers ticked steadily clear, honest. No cable snaking across, no risk of being drained by greed. That simple image filled me with an unfamiliar calm. It reminded me that sometimes, justice doesn't come with fanfare. It starts with something as quiet as keeping a light on, using power that's rightfully yours, as basic as protecting the small patch of earth you call home. Neighbors began stepping outside, some waving with friendly eyes. I waved waved back, feeling a lightness I hadn't felt in months. There were no more suspicious glances, no more whispered judgment. Instead, trust was beginning to grow again, slowly but surely. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least today, we had stepped out from under Vivian's heavy shadow. I turned to look at Elena, who was now drawing on the concrete with colored chalk, her legs folded comfortably beneath, utterly at ease. A small picture was taking shape: flowers and a sun, simple but full of happiness. I sat down beside her, smiling gently. "You see, Elena? Now we can draw whatever we want." She nodded, continuing to add bright strokes, humming a tune she'd made up. Inside me, a deep peace began to bloom. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but the kind of steady quiet that follows a storm. I knew life would bring more challenges, but if I could hold on to this calm, I could face anything. And watching my daughter smile in the middle of our yard, I knew I hadn't fought in vain. Justice had returned, starting right here, in this little house called home. 1 week after Vivian Cross left the lakeside neighborhood, the residents held a new meeting. The atmosphere in the meeting room that day was completely different from before. Instead of tense faces and averted eyes, I saw relieved smiles and a sense of anticipation. People brought coffee and pastries, sitting side by side, chatting comfortably. For the first time, an HOA meeting felt more like a gathering of neighbors than a high-pressure tribunal. When I was invited to speak, the room fell silent. I stood up, letting my eyes travel across the room. The same faces that once seemed fearful now looked bright, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. I took a deep breath and said, "Don't let silence feed the monster." The words echoed through the room. I saw heads nodding, few eyes glistening. I continued, "For years, we endured in fear. We believed staying quiet would keep things peaceful. But in reality, that silence only made Vivian stronger, made her believe no one would ever stand against her. If we had spoken up sooner, maybe things would have turned out differently. But today, we have a chance to begin again, to build a community that is fair, transparent, and humane." Applause erupted throughout the room, not the polite, restrained kind, but the kind that came from the heart, from shared understanding. A woman stood up and called out, "Marcus is right. I was once so afraid I couldn't speak when I was unfairly fined. But now I see that if everyone stays silent, there will never be justice." A man followed, "From now on, we have to watch together, and never let anyone use the HOA as a tool for oppression again." The room echoed with voices of agreement, a collective pledge being made out loud. I looked around and saw Mr. Alvarez seated in the front row, his eyes filled with pride. He nodded slowly, his lips silently repeating the words I had just spoken. I knew that, in his heart, the long chapter of quiet suffering had finally come to an end. That meeting wasn't just about forming a new board, it became a space where people shared their lessons. Everyone had something to say, from the fears they'd lived through to the hope they had just regained. One elderly woman declared she would never again let anyone intimidate her just because she hung a curtain of a different color. A young man promised he'd stand up for his neighbors if he ever saw injustice. When the meeting ended, I stepped out of the room feeling light. There was no longer the shadow of Vivian, no threats looming overhead. In their place was the unity of a collective. For the first time, I truly believed that Lakeside could become a real community, a place where people lived with fairness and mutual respect. The sound of applause from the meeting still echoed in my mind as I arrived home. Elena ran out to greet me, asking how the meeting went. I knelt down, ruffled her hair, and smiled. "Things are better now, sweetheart. I think from now on, we'll live in a neighborhood where everyone has the courage to speak the truth." Within me, an unwavering belief took root. That lesson wasn't just for Lakeside, but for any community. Justice only exists when people have the courage to speak up. And from this moment on, I knew that the neighbors around me truly understood that. After that meeting, it was as if Lakeside had entered a new era. The faces that had once been accustomed to caution now looked brighter. Greetings felt natural, and most importantly, the suffocating atmosphere that had hung over the neighborhood was gone. The HOA, once twisted by Vivian Cross into a tool of suppression, began to be rebuilt. A new board was elected with full support from the residents, featuring trustworthy individuals under transparent oversight. I was invited to join the advisory group, not as a leader, but as a witness and a reminder. We agreed that every decision must be made transparently, every financial detail openly posted on the community board. Residents had the right to speak, the right to question, and, more importantly, their voice would be taken seriously. The old, distorted rules were reviewed, unreasonable fines were abolished, and any regulations rooted in discrimination were struck down. In their place, the new HOA focused on what truly mattered: security, cleanliness, and community-building activities. Once people realized the rules no longer served individual power, they became willing to cooperate, to contribute to making the neighborhood better. I clearly remember one afternoon when the new board posted a detailed report on the quarterly budget. Neighbors gathered around to read, some nodding, others asking questions. But unlike before, no one feared being singled out for oppositional behavior. Instead, every question was answered on the spot, and every expense had a clear explanation. Trust was built little by little, and I saw in everyone's eyes that the old fear had been replaced by mutual respect. An elderly man said to me after one of the smaller meetings, "Now I finally feel like I'm truly part of this place. Before, I always thought of the HOA as a hammer hanging over my head. Now, finally feels like it belongs to us." I nodded, warmth rising in my chest. That, more than anything, was the true result of everything we'd been through. From that point on, the HOA became transparent and fair. People no longer lived under the shadow of irrational control, no longer worried that a baseless fine would appear in their mailbox. Meetings were filled with constructive voices, not bowed silence. They discussed building a playground for the kids, planting more trees along the walkway, and organizing a summer festival to bring everyone together. During those conversations, I often fell silent, looking around to take it all in. Elena playing with her friends in the yard, Mr. Alvarez chatting easily with neighbors he used to avoid. I realized that this change in the HOA had restored people's belief in justice, and that belief had become the strength holding the community together. No one dares to place themselves above the law anymore. The downfall of Vivian Cross stands as a clear testament that anyone who abuses power to oppress others will eventually fall. People retell that story as a spoken lesson, to make sure it's never forgotten. Whenever someone proposes a new idea, there's always a voice that reminds, "Make sure it's fair for everyone. We're not going back to the old shadows." There, I stand on my porch, watching my daughter play under the fading afternoon light, listening to neighbors call out to one another with cheerful ease, and a strange sense of peace fills me. I know now that Lakeside has turned a page. Justice isn't some distant concept. It lives in the smallest detail. A public notice board, a friendly smile, a nod of mutual respect. And it all began with the choice of a community that dared to speak truth. There are images etched so deeply into memory that no passage of time can ever fade them. For me, it's the moment Vivian Cross's red ATV burst into flames in the dead of night, the firelight flickering across her face. I remember the look in her eyes, panic, terror so starkly different from the arrogant gaze she once cast at me during our confrontation. In that single instant, I saw the mask of false power fall away, revealing a bare, fragile, defeated human being. I stood with my arms crossed. No need to shout, no need to explain. Flames and smoke spoke for me. That was the moment all abuse of power was reduced to ash, not just a vehicle turned to cinders, but the collapse of the tiny empire Vivian had built for herself. An ATV could be replaced, but lost honor can never be reclaimed. After that night, life in Lakeside changed completely. People began to speak more openly, to be more candid, and slowly relearned how to trust one another. I no longer walked the neighborhood under suspicious stares. Instead, warm greetings and genuine handshake became the norm. Elena no longer clung to my side. She ran freely into the yard, laughing and playing with her friends. Every time I pass by Vivian's old house, now locked and lifeless, I think of the wire that once snaked across the fence. From that one small cable, so many conflicts erupt, so many secrets were dragged into the light. It reminds me that evil doesn't always arrive grand and monstrous. It often begins with a petty act of greed and grows unchecked into something oppressive. And if no one stands up to it, keeps growing. I wonder if Vivian ever thinks back to that moment when the fire rose, and the truth was laid bare for all to see. Or does she still cling to blame, nursing her grudge? Either way, it no longer matters. What matters is that this community saw clearly, learned a hard lesson. No one gets to declare themselves the law. One evening, I sat with Mr. Alvarez on his porch, both of us watching the sunset blaze red across the sky. He chuckled softly and said, "Marcus, I've lived here for decades, but I've never seen Lakeside truly free until now." I turned to him and smiled. We were both thinking of the same image, the flames consuming the ATV, and the day this neighborhood was set free. This ending wasn't about revenge, it was about release. I felt satisfied not because Vivian had fallen, but because the truth had won, because Elena could laugh, and because neighbors could look each other in the eye, without fear. A sense of serenity rose quietly within me, difficult to describe. I knew that everything I had gone through would remain a deeply etched memory, a reminder not just for myself but for this entire community. Justice doesn't arrive through hollow slogans, through firm actions, sometimes silent, yet unshakably strong. And it was from those very actions that a neighborhood once shrouded in darkness found its way back to light. I watched Elena draw flowers with colored chalk on the front pavement, heard the neighbors laughing out on the street, and in that moment, I knew the story had come to an end. An ending satisfying enough that anyone who looked back on it would feel fulfilled, because justice had not forgotten us. And I silently thought, from the ashes of that ATV, a new community had been reborn. Sometimes, when I reflect on what happened in Lakeside, every detail feels as fresh as if it were yesterday. From Vivian Cross's arrogant gaze during the meetings, to the roar of her ATV every morning like a taunt, and then finally, the moment that same vehicle burst into flames, consuming the entire facade of her fabricated authority. It all became a continuous chain of memory, leading to a truth that no one in the community could deny. What I I contemplate most is the journey justice had to take to arrive. People often expect fairness to come instantly, but in truth, it always walks through fire. I endured cruel gossip, absurd fines, and even isolation from neighbors I once believed I could count on. But it was precisely those long, bitter days forged the strength so that, when the truth erupted, it struck sharp and undeniable. Justice may come slowly, but when it does, it sweeps away every lie. Vivian's excuses crumbled the moment the footage played, the moment her ATV stood as nothing more than a scorched frame, and the moment the entire community rose to reclaim their right to speak. No manipulation could cover it anymore. No seat of power was strong enough to protect her from the truth. I remember the whispers after the fire, the nods, casually spoken words sharp as blades. Stealing and playing the victim, that's the price she paid. No one had to shout, no one had to explain, because they had all seen it with their own eyes. No more doubts, no more sides to pick, just a quiet acknowledgement that deceit had collapsed under the weight of truth. The day Vivian moved out, the whole neighborhood watched in silence. No goodbyes, no one stopping her, only cold, steady eyes following as the small truck disappeared down the road. She left quietly, but behind her, people murmured, not in fear this time. Their voices were clear, eerily united, and every single one said, "She got what she deserved." Since then, Lakeside has changed from its very roots. HOA meetings are no longer a one-woman show, but open discussions where everyone contributes. Neighbors no longer live withdrawn, but share openly, because they've realized that silence is what empowers tyrants. I often hear Elena laughing with her friends, and in that laughter, I see an entire new generation growing up free from the weight of fear. Many people came to me, thanking me for not backing down. I always responded that justice didn't belong to me alone, but to everyone who dared to speak up. If Mr. Alvarez hadn't brought forth the evidence, if the residents hadn't collectively opposed during the meeting, I would have been just a lone voice, easily silent. It was unity that turned justice into a blade sharp enough to end the long days of darkness. Now, whenever I pass by the empty patch of lawn where the ATV once stood, I see it as a marker, no longer an image of defiance, but a symbol of the lesson. Any abuse of power, no matter how arrogant, will eventually be brought down when the light of truth shines on it. I sometimes pause, gently touch fence where the cable once ran, and remind myself that the very place where injustice began was also where fairness was restored. That ending was satisfying not merely because the oppressor was throned, but because the community found itself again. Lakeside no longer trembles at the sound of an ATV engine, no longer sighs at the sight of a citation. In its place are laughter, conversation, and that is the true victory, the triumph of those who once bowed their head, now standing tall and saying, "We deserve to live with fairness." For me, the moment the ATV exploded was not just a personal reckoning, but the end of an era. Closed one chapter and opened another, where justice was no longer an abstract ideal but present in every smile, every glance, every handshake between neighbors. And that is why, whenever I look back, I still feel a deep, quiet, proud sense of satisfaction. Looking back on everything we went through, I realized the journey at Lakeside wasn't just about a burned ATV or the downfall of Vivian Cross. It was a full portrait of a community that once lived in fear, once bowed to absurdity, and ultimately reclaimed its voice and dignity. Every incident, from the cable draped across the fence, to the senseless citations, to the moment the fire erupted, formed a larger picture of how people resist when pushed to the edge. I still remember the first moment I noticed the electric bill had spiked without reason. That suspicion led me to the fence, where the cable stretching into Vivian's yard exposed the raw truth. First, I thought it was just a petty act, but the cold insult she hurled at me foretold a long battle ahead. When Vivian publicly shouted that I was a troublemaker, I understood I wasn't just confronting a case of electricity theft, but an entire system that had been manipulated. The days that followed were tension. I received one citation after another, heard vicious rumors spreading through the neighborhood, and watched as neighbors grew wary instead of daring to stand by me. But even in that darkness, I felt the quiet solidarity of Mr. Alvarez, and the evidence he had safeguarded for years. It was the first flicker of light, reminding me that I wasn't entirely alone. The moment I decided to install the circuit breaker, many might have seen it as an act of revenge, but in truth, it was my way of forcing the truth into the open. I didn't resort to violence, nor did I need to humiliate anyone with words. I simply created the opportunity for deceit to burn itself out, and when the ATV exploded like fireworks in front of dozens of witnesses, everyone understood they had been deceived for years. Vivian, once the enforcer of rules, became the clearest violator of them all. After the explosion, the image of Vivian screaming, desperately trying to frame me, left a deep impression, but this time, she no longer commanded trust. Footage from the security camera and testimonies from neighbors made the truth undeniable, and the police filed an official report confirming the acts of electricity theft and endangerment to the community. That was the turning point that cost Vivian everything. The HOA president's decency she had clung to for years was stripped away, her reputation collapsed, and she left the neighborhood in silence, head bowed, without a single farewell. But the story didn't end with Vivian's fall. What mattered more was how the community came back to life. Once fear disappeared, neighbors began greeting one another, and HOA meetings transformed from oppressive mandates into open discussion. People found the courage to speak about the injustices they'd endured, to tell the truth. And from there, Lakeside became a place truly worth living in. The greatest lesson I learned was this: silence can be an ally of evil. For years, Vivian grew stronger because people chose to bow their head, thinking that tolerance would preserve. But tolerance only gave tyranny room to grow. When one person stands up, others find their courage. And when a community unites, no oppressor, no matter how powerful, can remain standing. I also realized that justice isn't some distant ideal, it exists in small, everyday acts. Justice is when a father keeps his home's electric meter clean so his daughter can play outside without worry. Justice is when an old man like Alvarez patiently holds on to photographs, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Justice is when a community dares to applaud an agreement, dares to say, "Remove her," instead of staying silent. It may come late, but when it arrives, it sweeps away every lie and restores the fairness that belongs to everyone. Elena, my daughter, is the clearest proof of that outcome. Once a child who was afraid to step outside, now she smiles freely and says, "Daddy, I'm not scared anymore." I watch her play, listen to her laughter echo through the garden, and know that everything I endured was worth it. I didn't just protect myself, I gave my daughter a childhood no longer shadowed by fear. The story of Lakeside, in the end, isn't just mine or my neighbors. It's a message for anyone who has ever lived in a community ruled by an abusive individual or group. Don't believe you're too small. Don't believe your voice doesn't matter. Once the truth is lit, it spreads and becomes a force no one can extinguish. And if someone were to ask me what brought me the greatest satisfaction, I would say it wasn't seeing Vivian fall, but the moment I saw neighbors look at each other with trust again. A community is only truly strong when people are willing to listen to one another and stand together to protect justice. When I remember the panic in Vivian's eyes as the ATV exploded, I don't see it as a personal victory, but as the end of a dark era. It reminds me that justice may arrive late, but when it does, it is more powerful than any excuse. And in Lakeside, everyone said the same thing in unison: she deserved. From a stolen power cord, an entire system of deceit was exposed. From a single fire, a whole community reclaimed its freedom. That's the kind of ending that leaves me, and anyone who witnessed it, filled and certain that justice always exists, just waiting for us to call it by name.